It was a chilly Friday evening in early October when 17-year-old Hannah Thompson found herself alone in her parents' house in the suburbs of Rochester, New York. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving her in charge of the house and her younger brother Liam, who was staying with a friend for a sleepover. Hannah had looked forward to a weekend of solitude, thinking she could catch up on her reading, binge-watch shows, and maybe even indulge in the junk food her mom forbade during the week. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards that had always seemed a little too loud when she was alone. The first unusual thing happened around 9 p.m. Hannah had just settled on the couch with a blanket and a bowl of popcorn when she heard it. A faint thump coming from the kitchen. At first, she ignored it, thinking it was just the settling of the house. But then it came again. Louder this time. Thump. Thump. Her pulse quickened. The kitchen was at the back of the house, past the long hallway, and she could see its dim light flickering under the doorway. Hannah told herself it was probably the refrigerator or something falling in the pantry. Still, curiosity got the better of her, and she tiptoed down the hallway, gripping her phone like a lifeline. She flicked the light on in the kitchen. Everything was in its place. The trash was empty, the fridge doors were shut, and nothing had fallen from the shelves. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Get a grip, Hannah. It's just the house." She turned to leave, but then she noticed it, a small, dark smudge on the kitchen counter. At first, she thought it was chocolate or something from her earlier snack, but as she leaned closer, she realized it looked like a fingerprint. A large one that hadn't been there before. Her stomach churned. She wiped it away with a paper towel, convincing herself it had been dust or dirt from the air. The night continued uneventfully, or so she thought. Around midnight, Hannah was brushing her teeth when she heard it again, a whisper, barely audible, coming from the living room. She froze. Her heart raced. "Liam?" she called, even though she knew he wasn't home. No answer. The whisper came again, clearer this time, like someone saying her name. "Hannah!" Hannah dropped the toothbrush into the sink and ran to the living room. The lights were off, and everything seemed normal, but she could swear she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Something darted behind the couch, fast and silent. She switched the lights on and flicked the television on, thinking a sudden burst of noise would chase away her imagination. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. By morning, Hannah tried to convince herself it had all been a dream or a product of loneliness. She went about her day, keeping busy with chores and homework, but the house had other plans. That night, she was in her room, scrolling through her phone when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, coming down from the top floor. Panic gripped her. "Mom? Dad?" she called, voice trembling. No answer. The steps stopped halfway down. Then silence. She stayed in her room until she fell asleep, too scared to move. The next day was worse. Hannah was doing laundry in the basement when the washing machine suddenly stopped mid-cycle. The lights flickered. Then the faint sound of children laughing echoed through the basement. Hannah froze, heart thudding. Liam wasn't there, and the laughter was too high-pitched to belong to an adult. She ran upstairs and slammed the basement door behind her. By the third night, the house was fully alive with things she couldn't explain. Doors would slam shut on their own, faucets would turn on with no one touching them, and the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, making her breath visible. Most terrifying of all were the whispers. They didn't come from any particular direction, but seemed to float through the house, repeating her name over and over in a distorted, hollow voice. Hannah tried to ignore it, but sleep became impossible. She would wake up to see shadows moving across her walls, shapes that didn't belong. Sometimes she would hear scratching on her bedroom door at 2 a.m. as if something were trying to get in. One night, around 2:30 a.m., Hannah was jolted awake by the sound of a door creaking open. She sat up, heart hammering, and saw her bedroom door slowly moving as if pushed by an unseen hand. She tried to tell herself it was the wind, but the windows were closed. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about a possible break-in. When she finished, she realized something even more terrifying. The operator's voice sounded distant and hollow, distorted, as if coming from underwater. Then the door slammed shut, hard. The lights went out. Hannah was plunged into darkness. her phone battery dying mid-call. She was alone, truly alone, and the house was no longer a safe place. For the next several days, the hauntings escalated. Objects moved on their own, sometimes violently. Her bed sheets would be pulled off while she slept. Mirrors reflected things that weren't there. She saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, always just for a moment before disappearing. Once, she glimpsed it in the hallway mirror, a tall, thin silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Hannah's fear became all-consuming. She started keeping knives in her room, leaving lights on at all times, and even trying to communicate with whatever was in the house. One night, desperate for answers, she whispered, "Who are you?" The response was chilling. A voice, dry and hollow, whispered back, "I was here first." It wasn't the first time anyone had lived in the house that mattered. The voice implied a presence older, deeper, something that had been there long before her family moved in. Hannah called her parents, who were initially skeptical, suggesting she might be imagining things. But even they began to feel uneasy when she sent them photos. On one, a shadowy figure appeared behind her in the reflection of the kitchen window. On another, a handprint, blackened and smudged, appeared on the fridge, despite no one touching it. Things escalated until the final night. Hannah had barricaded herself in her room, placing heavy furniture in front of the door. She clutched a flashlight and a baseball bat, refusing to sleep. At 3:07 a.m., she heard it, the soft, deliberate steps ascending the stairs. They paused outside her door. Then the whispers began again. This time it was a chorus, overlapping voices all saying the same thing. "Leave, now, leave." Hannah didn't wait. She flung open the window and climbed onto the roof of the garage, shivering in the cold night air. She called the police as she did so. When they arrived, the house seemed normal, as if nothing had ever happened. No evidence of intrusion, no fingerprints, nothing. Yet Hannah knew what she had seen. She had felt it. A presence that was real and malevolent. Her parents returned the next day, and the house felt safe again, but Hannah could never shake the memory. She moved out a few months later, unable to face the walls and the creaking floors, the whispering shadows. Years later, she would still hear her name whispered when she was alone in a quiet room. She never returned to that house. People in the neighborhood avoided it. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed they had seen shadows move in the windows at night. The house stood empty, its secrets hidden behind closed doors, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stay alone. Hannah never forgot the feeling of being watched, the cold brush of air on her neck, the sense that something was always just behind her. And she knew, deep down, that whatever haunted that house was still there, waiting, patient, and hungry for the next person to call it home. Story the end. It was the first weekend of November in a quiet town in northern Ohio when 25-year-old Hannah Miller found herself alone in her family's farmhouse. Her parents had traveled to Detroit for a work conference, leaving her with explicit instructions. Lock all doors, keep the heating on, and avoid wandering into the cellar or the old barn behind the house. Hannah had lived in the farmhouse all her life, and she was familiar with every creak, every shadow, every draft that rattled the old windows. Still, something about the house at night, the way the moonlight filtered through the leafless trees, the long shadows cast by the gnarled branches, felt off. The evening began innocuously enough. Hannah had made herself a bowl of soup and curled up on the living room couch with a book. The fireplace crackled softly, sending flickering orange light across the room. Outside, the wind moaned and the skeletal trees scraped against the siding of the house, producing a rhythm that almost mimicked footsteps. At first, Hannah ignored it. She told herself it was just the wind. But then came the tapping, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably coming from upstairs. Her heart jumped. She froze, listening. The tapping moved, slow but purposeful, along the floorboards above her. Hannah called out, trying to steady her voice. "Hello? Mom? Dad?" Only silence answered her, aside from the tapping, which now seemed to inch closer to the top of the staircase. Hannah's mind raced. The house had always been quiet at night, but this was different. This was deliberate. A prickle of fear ran down her spine. She set her book aside and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the cold metal reassuring in her grip. With cautious steps, she ascended the staircase, each creak of the old wood amplifying the tension. At the top of the stairs, The hallway stretched longer than she remembered, shadows pooling in corners, almost moving in the periphery of her vision. At the end of the hall was the guest bedroom, a room she rarely entered. The door, which she had surely locked earlier, now hung slightly ajar. Her eyes immediately fell on faint footprints in the dust leading from the hallway into the room. Small, childlike, and definitely not hers. Her pulse pounded. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty, but the air was cold and heavy, sending shivers down her spine. Dust swirled faintly in the flashlight's beam, and scratches appeared on the floorboards. "Don't leave. Stay with me." Hannah felt her stomach knot. The house had always been familiar, but now it felt oppressive, alive, as if it were watching her. She stepped backward, unsure whether to flee or investigate further. Then she heard the whisper, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily. "Hannah, stay." Her breath caught in her throat. Then the closet door creaked open slowly. She froze. A small figure stepped out, a little girl, pale as the moonlight filtering through the window, with hollow black eyes and a tattered white dress. She tilted her head unnaturally and whispered, "Hannah, stay with me." Terror gripped Hannah. Her legs felt like lead. She stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in her hand, and bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The whispering followed, growing louder, overlapping with itself, filling the house. "Hannah, don't leave. Stay. Stay forever." The front door wouldn't open. The back door? Locked. Even the windows refused to budge. The house seemed alive, trapping her inside. From the basement came a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like heavy feet moving across the floor. The whispers intensified, an incomprehensible chorus of voices calling her name over and over. Desperate, she grabbed a kitchen knife and crept to the basement stairs. The air grew colder with each step, her breath visible in the dim light. The basement was dark, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. In the far corner, the little girl stood again, joined by a tall, shadowy figure, its form shifting like smoke. They didn't move at first, only observed her, patient and relentless. The whispers became commands. "You cannot leave. You belong here. Stay forever." Hannah swung the knife wildly, but it passed through them like mist. The temperature plunged further, and the shadows along the walls stretched and twisted into grotesque, human-like shapes. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours could have passed. She huddled in a corner, trembling, unwilling to close her eyes for fear that they would come closer while she slept. At some point, exhaustion took her. When she awoke, the basement was silent. The oppressive pressure lifted slightly. Trembling, she ran upstairs and searched every room. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched persisted. By dawn, she forced open the front door and fled, driving hours away without looking back. Weeks later, she discovered that previous occupants of the farmhouse had reported similar phenomena. Unexplained footsteps, doors locking on their own, faint childlike voices, and footprints that appeared and disappeared. Months later, Hannah still felt the presence following her. Quiet rooms and empty streets seemed to echo with whispers at the edge of perception. Shadows in corners appeared to move when she wasn't looking directly at them, and at night, when she was alone, she could hear the faintest voice calling her name. "Hannah, don't leave. Stay with us." She never returned to the farmhouse. She couldn't. The memory, the whispers, and the hollow eyes of the little girl lingered. A reminder that some spirits never let go, some houses never release the living, and isolation can open a door to the unseen. Story the end. It had been a quiet week in my little rented house just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. I was 27, freshly moved into a small one-story home on the edge of a suburb that didn't see much traffic after dark. The street was lined with old maples and oaks, their branches clawing the sky in the dim streetlight. The house itself wasn't anything special. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, a small kitchen that smelled faintly of mildew. But it was cheap, and I liked the isolation. I liked being home alone. I had just returned from work one Friday evening, the sky a dark canvas streaked with the last of sunset. My friends had gone out for a Halloween party, but I declined. I preferred the quiet. I made some spaghetti and ate in front of the television, the sound of the news blaring softly in the background. After I cleaned up, I settled into the couch with a mug of tea, my cat, Sam, curled up on my lap. That's when I first noticed it. A soft tapping sound from the kitchen. I froze. Sam's ears twitched. I listened. Tap, tap, tap. I told myself it was the faucet dripping or maybe the wind rattling the window frames. But the house was still. I rose slowly and walked into the kitchen. Nothing. Just the dim light from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every small noise, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves against the window, made me sit up in bed. I chalked it up to nerves, being alone for the first weekend in the new house. But when I awoke the next morning, something felt off. My living room window, which I always closed before bed, was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. I spent the day trying to rationalize everything. Windows can stick open, floors creak naturally, and cats move things. But as the week wore on, strange things became harder to explain. It began subtly. Items in the kitchen were not where I left them. A mug on the counter one moment would be on the table the next. I convinced myself I was forgetting. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing the hallway outside my bedroom. I'd hear them at night, always starting around 2 a.m., walking back and forth, slow and steady. Sam would hiss at the walls and crouch low, his tail twitching. One night, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door opening. I slept with it closed, but now I could hear it squeak on its hinges as if someone or something was pushing it open. I sat up, heart hammering, clutching the blanket like a shield. The door stopped moving. Silence. I didn't breathe, didn't dare move, until the sound of faint whispering drifted through the air. It wasn't a language I recognized. Just low murmurs, almost like a conversation that had no words. I spent the next day at work trying to push it from my mind, but by the time I returned home, unease had wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I told a friend over the phone, half joking, half serious. She laughed and said, "You're alone. You're stressed. Maybe the house is just settling." I wanted to believe that. The next night was worse. I had gone to bed around midnight, exhausted when I heard it again, the pacing footsteps, this time downstairs. I lived alone, so logically, it had to be my imagination. But then the kitchen lights flickered on. Not just the overhead ones, but the under-cabinet lights too, bathing the counters in an unnatural glow. Sam bolted off the bed, fur bristling, hissing at nothing. I froze, staring at the dark hallway. Then the lights went out. I didn't sleep at all that night. The days and nights after escalated. Items would vanish. Keys, notebooks, my phone, and reappear in strange places. Drawers that were closed were open. Closet doors were sometimes ajar when I knew I had left them shut. And the tapping sound continued, now accompanied by something heavier. A slow, dragging sound from the basement. I hadn't gone down there much. The basement smelled of damp earth and old wood, a lingering chill even in the warmer months. Finally, I decided to investigate. I descended the steps with a flashlight, the beam cutting through thick darkness. The sound stopped the moment my foot hit the last step. The room was empty. My gaze swept across the shelves, the water heater, the corners of the basement, and then I saw it, a single shoe, not mine, neatly placed in the center of the concrete floor. I didn't recognize it. I dropped the flashlight, heart pounding. When I bent to pick it up, it vanished, just gone. I began documenting everything, keeping a notebook. Every sound, every movement, every item that disappeared or reappeared. I even set up my phone to record overnight, hoping to capture something, anything, tangible. And I did. The first playback was mostly static and the occasional groan of the house, but then I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my bedroom wall. I froze when I recognized the rhythm. I had heard it before, the very first night I slept there. On another clip, I heard whispering, soft and urgent, as if someone were trying to communicate. Not words, just syllables, repeated over and over. And the worst, the sound of my own name, whispered so clearly it made my stomach twist. By this point, I wasn't sleeping. I barricaded the bedroom door, propped chairs under handles, placed knives on the floor around the bed, and even slept with my phone clutched in my hand. Nothing stopped it. One night, I woke to the sensation of weight on the bed, like someone sitting at the edge. Sam was hissing and growling, hair on end. I flicked on the light. The bed was empty. Nothing had touched it, but the indentation in the mattress was there, still warm to the touch. Weeks passed. I avoided the basement. I didn't cook at night. I barely left my bedroom after dark. Yet the house seemed alive with quiet malice. Doors would slam on their own, lights would flicker, always in the same sequence. And always, the footsteps, the taps, the whispers. I tried to tell myself it was stress, isolation, overwork, but the evidence was undeniable. Someone, or something, was in the house. One Friday night, after a particularly long day of freelance work, I was sprawled on the couch, exhausted and trembling. The lights flickered violently and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the cold air. Then I heard it. A voice. Clear, sharp, right next to my ear. Get out. I bolted upright, tearing out of the living room toward the front door. The handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Behind me, the whispers surged into a cacophony of overlapping voices. Sam hissed and scratched at the floor, trying to escape. Then the dragging sound started again, louder this time, coming from the hallway, closer, circling the couch. I grabbed my laptop and ran into the kitchen, throwing knives at anything that moved in the shadows. The temperature kept dropping. My hands were shaking, teeth chattering. Then the dragging stopped. Silence. Sam fled under the fridge. I was alone in that oppressive quiet, shivering sweat and cold mixing on my skin. Finally, I made a decision. I grabbed my coat, my phone, anything I could carry, and ran to my car. The street was empty, the air crisp and biting. I didn't look back until I reached my friend's apartment 20 minutes away. When I finally did, the house behind me was dark, silent, perfectly ordinary from the outside. I knew it wouldn't stay that way. The next week, I contacted the landlord and explained the situation. He hesitated, then admitted something strange. The previous tenants had complained of strange occurrences, always while alone. He said they eventually left, unable to tolerate it. A quick search online turned up nothing about violent crime, no reports of break-ins, just anecdotal warnings in neighborhood forums about the house being weird. I haven't been back. I rented another place across town. Sometimes I hear tapping or think I see shadows in the corner of my vision, but I tell myself it's the house behind me, the one I escaped. I know better. That house isn't empty, and it never will be. Even now, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I sometimes hear 3 soft knocks on the wall. Always 3. Always deliberate. Story the end. It was the first Friday night of October when Emily found herself alone in the house. Her parents had gone to visit her grandmother for the weekend, leaving her to manage the creaky old Victorian home she had grown up in. She had always loved the house's old charm, the way the wooden floors groaned underfoot, the ornate molding around every doorway, the way the shadows stretched across the living room when the sun dipped below the horizon. But tonight, something felt different. The house didn't just feel empty, it felt watched. Emily sat curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, scrolling aimlessly on her phone. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the tree's branches tapped like skeletal fingers against the panes. She tried to shrug off the feeling, telling herself it was just the isolation. Her parents had always teased her for being easily spooked, but deep down, she couldn't shake the sense that something in the house was waiting, biding its time. It started subtly. The first oddity was a sound, a soft, almost inaudible creak from the hallway outside the living room. At first, Emily assumed it was the house settling or perhaps the wind shifting a window. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate footstep, soft but unmistakably human. She froze, holding her breath. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling more than she intended. Silence followed. Trying to convince herself it was nothing, she grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the hallway. The old floorboards groaned under her weight. The air felt colder here, and the beam of light from her phone trembled slightly as she moved. The hallway was empty. Doors to bedrooms and the bathroom were all shut, the shadows stretching dark and still. She took a deep breath and laughed nervously. "Okay, Emily, you're being ridiculous. There's no one here." She turned to head back to the living room, but that's when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near her parents' bedroom, the faint outline of a figure seemed to be standing in the darkness. She froze again, heart hammering. It didn't move at first, just lingered. Then, ever so slightly, the figure tilted its head, as if observing her. Emily blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. Her instincts screamed at her to leave the house, but her body refused to move. She told herself she was imagining things, that the shadows played tricks on the mind. But deep down, she knew what she saw. She felt it. The house had changed tonight. She decided to call her parents, but the line was dead. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows more violently now. She could hear the trees scratching against the house, sounding almost like fingernails on the siding. A cold draft brushed past her shoulder, and she spun around, flashlight raised, that heart in her throat, but no one was there. Emily tried to keep busy. She grabbed a book from the shelf and tried to read, but the words blurred together. Every so often, she'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow flitting just beyond her line of sight. Each time she turned, there was nothing there. The unease was suffocating. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. The sun had set completely, leaving the house bathed in darkness except for the weak glow of the street lamp outside. She decided to check the basement, figuring it was the oldest part of the house and might explain the creaks and noises. She took a deep breath and descended the narrow staircase, flashlight shaking in her hand. The air in the basement was colder, damp, and musty, filled with the scent of old wood and mildew. She stepped carefully, scanning the corners. That's when she heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Emily? Her name echoed softly in the damp air, curling around her like smoke. She spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the basement was empty. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run upstairs and lock the door behind her, but curiosity kept her rooted. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. Silence followed, except for the faint drip of water from somewhere in the far corner. Then it came again, a little louder this time. Closer. "Emily?" Her heart pounded. The whispering wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It seemed to move around her. She took a step back, tripping over a box, and the flashlight clattered to the floor, illuminating the basement in harsh, uneven beams. And then she saw it. A shadowy figure crouched near the far wall, just out of the light. It wasn't fully formed, more like a dark smear against the corner, but she could feel its presence, just heavy and oppressive. Emily scrambled to her feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She locked it and pressed her back against it, gasping for breath. But the feeling didn't go away. The house felt alive now, each creak and groan like a deliberate message. She could hear footsteps above her in the living room. Slow. Deliberate. Walking in circles. Desperate, she grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer and crept toward the living room. The air was thick, cold, and her breath came in shaky gasps. She called out again, louder this time, "I'm alone. Who's here?" For a long moment, there was nothing, and then she heard it. Laughter. Low, hollow, and echoing off the walls. Not human laughter, but something twisted, something that made her skin crawl. The sound moved through the house, circling her, growing louder and closer. Emily's hands shook as she clutched the knife, every muscle in her body tense. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. Panic overtook her. She ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. She tried the back door. It was locked too, from the inside. The whispers returned, a chorus of voices now, circling her. "Emily! Emily! Come to us!" She backed into the corner of the living room, heart racing, knife trembling in her hand. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe across the walls, forming shapes that weren't there before. Faces, twisted and hollow-eyed, seemed to leer at her from the darkness. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound that echoed through the house. Then the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath fogged in front of her face. A figure appeared in the corner of the room. A woman in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and eyes dark voids. Emily froze, unable to move. The woman tilted her head and smiled, though no lips moved. A voice, cold and hollow, filled the room. "You shouldn't be here." Emily dropped the knife and bolted, running toward the staircase. The shadows lunged at her, almost tangible, brushing against her arms like icy fingers. She scrambled up the stairs 2 at a time, tripping and catching herself on the railing. The whispers and laughter followed her, louder and more insistent. She reached her bedroom and slammed the door, locking it. Inside, she pressed herself against the doors, shaking uncontrollably. The doorknob rattled as if someone or something was trying to get in. She could hear soft footsteps pacing outside, then a voice, barely above a whisper. "Emily, you can't hide." Hours seemed to pass. She sat in the dark, clutching her knees, listening to the house breathe around her. When morning finally came, the first rays of sunlight seeping through the curtains, the house was silent. Emily didn't dare leave her room. She stayed put until her parents returned that evening, insisting she hadn't felt well. They found nothing unusual. No signs of intruders, no disturbances, only Emily, pale and trembling. She never spoke about that night again. But the feeling stayed with her, the sense that something in the house had noticed her, had marked her. Every time she walked past the hallway where she had seen the figure, a chill ran down her spine. Every so often, when she was alone, she thought she heard a whisper, faint and carried on the wind. Emily? Years later, when she had moved into her own apartment, she still checked the corners of rooms, listened for strange noises, and flinched at shadows. She knew, deep down, that whatever had been in that house hadn't left her completely. And on some nights, when the wind howled and the moon was high, she could swear she felt it behind her, watching, waiting. Story, the end. It was a cold November evening when 16-year-old Emily Sanders found herself alone in her family's old Victorian home in upstate New York. Her parents had gone to a work conference in Boston, leaving her with strict instructions. No parties, lock all doors, and absolutely no inviting friends over. Emily had spent the first few hours indulging in the rare freedom, binge-watching her favorite series and ordering a pizza without anyone's judgment. As darkness settled outside, the house seemed unusually quiet, almost unnaturally so, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees surrounding the property. The house itself was an imposing structure, a relic of the early 1900s with creaking floorboards, narrow hallways, and ornate woodwork that looked impressive by day but menacing by night. Emily had lived there her entire life, yet the shadows in the corners always seemed deeper after sunset. Around 9:30 p.m., she went to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water and froze when she heard the distinct sound of someone walking across the living room floor above her. She shook her head, assuming it was just the house settling, but the sound repeated, a slow, deliberate shuffle, then a pause, then the shuffle again. Curiosity piqued, she grabbed a flashlight and ascended the narrow staircase, the beam cutting through the darkness. She checked the second-floor hallway and every bedroom. All doors were closed and empty. She leaned against the wall, heart pounding, trying to convince herself she had imagined it. But when she turned back toward the stairs, she noticed something odd. The front door at the bottom was ajar. Emily was certain she had locked it. Panic set in, and she grabbed her phone, intending to call her parents or the police, only to find it dead. The charger in her room had been unplugged. Strange, since she never touched it. She frantically plugged it in, waiting for the battery to charge, and heard, faintly, the soft whisper of a voice behind her. It was so faint she wasn't sure she had really heard it. Emily. Her stomach dropped. She spun around. Nothing was there. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just nerves, but then the whisper came again, closer this time, almost at her ear. Emily, don't go down. She froze, her flashlight flickering, and a cold gust of wind blew down the hallway. The house's heating had been on, so this sudden chill made her skin crawl. She took a step backward, tripping over something on the floor. Looking down, she saw a small, folded piece of paper. Hands trembling, she picked it up. Written in what looked like messy, childlike handwriting were the words, "I see you. You shouldn't be here alone." Her breathing quickened. Emily backed toward the staircase and decided she had to leave the house immediately. But as she reached the bottom, the front door slammed shut on its own. She pulled at it, but it wouldn't budge. Then she heard it, a soft, dragging sound coming from the living room. It was like something heavy being pulled across the floor, moving slowly toward her. She shined her flashlight in the direction of the sound and caught sight of a shadow, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the light. It didn't move like a person. It seemed to hover, disconnected from the floor, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Emily screamed and stumbled backward, falling onto the stairs. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the kitchen, searching for something, anything, to defend herself. Her eyes landed on a large carving knife. She gripped it tightly, hands shaking, and slowly turned toward the living room. The shadow had moved closer, now only a few feet away. She could make out faint features, hollow eyes, a mouth slightly open as if trying to speak, and skin that seemed almost translucent. The air around it was colder than anything she had ever felt. She lifted the knife and, in a sudden rush of courage, charged forward. The shadow vanished as she approached, leaving behind a lingering coldness and the faint smell of decaying wood. Emily's pulse raced as she backed into the kitchen, trying to rationalize what she had seen. But the house wasn't done. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the reflection in the stainless steel fridge. Another shadow, this one smaller, like a child, standing behind her. She spun around, but the kitchen was empty. That's when she realized the lights were out. The house was plunged into darkness, except for the weak beam of her flashlight. Panic overtook her. She ran upstairs and locked herself in her bedroom, barricading the door with her dresser. Her hands were slick with sweat, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She tried calling her parents again. Still no signal. Then, from the corner of the room, she heard the unmistakable sound of a child giggling softly. "Emily," the voice said again, this time from inside the room. The laughter was chilling, echoing off the walls. She screamed, banging on the door, and then everything went silent. For what felt like hours, she sat huddled on the floor, listening. Then a knock, soft but deliberate, came from the door. 1, 2, 3, slow knocks. She didn't answer. The knocks stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps walking across the ceiling above her, circling the room. She could hear whispering, murmuring, just on the edge of comprehension, like hundreds of voices overlapping. Her chest ached, but she forced herself to stay awake, fearing that sleep might invite the presence closer. At around 2 a.m., she heard movement outside her window. She cautiously peered through the blinds, expecting to see a tree branch swaying or a raccoon. Instead, she saw a pale figure standing in the backyard, motionless, staring directly at her. It was tall, thin, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Emily stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. When she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. She ran to the hallway mirror, and in the reflection she saw a shadow behind her, not attached to her body, moving independently. She turned around, knife in hand, and again nothing. But she could feel it, an oppressive presence, as if the air itself was watching, waiting. Hours passed, each second stretching longer than the last. She could hear things moving through the house, doors opening and closing, whispers, soft taps on the walls, and the dragging sound, always coming closer. Emily tried to stay near her bedroom, thinking if she stayed put, the presence couldn't reach her. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, like someone pacing just outside her door, waiting for her to make a mistake. She noticed scratches appearing on the floorboards around her bed, long, deep marks, as if something sharp had been dragged across the wood. She hadn't moved anything. There was no explanation. Around 5 a.m., exhausted and desperate, Emily made a risky decision. She bolted from her bedroom, knife in hand, and ran to the basement door. She remembered her parents always saying the basement had another exit, a small door leading to the side of the house. She descended the creaky stairs, flashlight flickering, heart racing. As she reached the bottom, she saw it. A figure at the foot of the basement stairs, head cocked at a strange angle, skin pale and almost translucent, and eyes black, hollow. It smiled. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat. Emily froze. The figure lunged, moving faster than its appearance should have allowed, and she barely managed to dodge. She scrambled to the side exit door, flinging it open, and ran into the backyard, the cold November air biting her skin. She didn't stop running until she reached the street. Her neighbors, awake early for work, stared at her in confusion and fear as she pounded on doors, screaming for help. Eventually, someone called the police. When the officers arrived and returned with her to the house, it was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of forced entry. No one was in the living room, no shadows on the walls, nothing. The only evidence of what had transpired were the scratches on the floorboards, the paper on the stairs, and her disheveled, terrified appearance. The officers chalked it up to an overactive imagination, stress, or maybe a dream fueled by the isolation. But Emily knew better. She refused to sleep in the house alone ever again. For weeks, she avoided it entirely, staying with friends or at a nearby cousin's house. But the experience haunted her, leaving her with a lingering fear, a sense that she was never truly alone. Months later, Emily's parents returned, unaware of the full extent of what had happened. She tried to tell them, but the words never seemed enough. One evening, while unpacking, she noticed something strange. A small piece of paper slipped between the pages of a book she hadn't touched since that night. Written on it in the same messy, childlike handwriting were the words, "I'm still here, waiting." Emily's blood ran cold. She tore the paper to pieces, but the memory and the feeling of being watched never left her. She eventually moved away for college, but she still felt it in quiet moments at night in unfamiliar rooms. The shadows seemed alive, waiting for someone to be alone, waiting for someone to notice. She never found out who or what it was, but she knew one thing. The house had marked her, and it would never truly let her go. Even now, years later, when she hears creaking in her apartment or a whisper just beyond comprehension, she remembers that night. The fear is still sharp, still immediate, as if it had been planted inside her, a constant reminder that some things are not meant to be alone. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, she swears she hears it. Story the end. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Jake found himself alone in his parents' house. His parents had gone out for a long weekend trip to the countryside, leaving him in charge. He had always liked the solitude of the house, with its creaking floors and old wooden walls. But tonight, the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it watches it. Jake was in his room, headphones in, scrolling through his phone to distract himself from the storm outside. Rain lashed against the windows, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the room in stark white bursts. He felt a shiver run down his spine, telling himself it was just the chill from the rain. But then he heard it, a soft, deliberate knock from the kitchen downstairs. At first, he froze. The house was supposed to be empty. He took out his earbuds and listened carefully. The knock came again, low and deliberate, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, dragging, as though someone was walking carefully across the wooden floor. He tried to rationalize it. Probably just the wind, or the storm rattling something, he muttered, though his voice sounded weak even to himself. Jake grabbed a flashlight and crept to the top of the stairs. The beam of light trembled in his hand as he peered down into the living room. Everything looked normal, or as normal as a stormy, empty house could appear. The kitchen door was slightly ajar. He took a deep breath and walked toward it. The closer he got, the colder the air became, the flashlight beam flickering slightly as though resisting him. When he entered the kitchen, nothing seemed out of place. The rain had left streaks on the windows, and the counters were clean. But then he noticed something strange. The kitchen knife block was toppled over, knives scattered across the floor. He hadn't touched it, and yet there was no one there. Jake bent down to pick up the knives, and that's when he heard it. A whisper, barely audible, coming from the pantry. "Jake!" He froze. The sound was unmistakable, soft, deliberate, calling his name. He swung the flashlight toward the pantry, the beam shaking in his hand. The door was slightly open, the darkness inside impenetrable. The whisper came again, this time slightly closer. "Jake!" His pulse raced. He wanted to run, to leave the house, but something compelled him to see. He pushed the pantry door open, flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. The shelves were empty, but the air was icy, his breath forming clouds in front of him. He stepped back and the door slammed shut behind him. Jake's heart pounded as he tried to open it, but it was stuck. Then he felt it, a presence behind him. He spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, and saw a figure crouched in the corner. Its shape was human, but indistinct, blurred, like smoke caught in the shadows. Two faint, glowing eyes stared at him. Who are you?" Jake stammered, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer, but it moved slightly, tilting its head as if studying him. Then it vanished. He stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling hard to the floor. The flashlight rolled away, leaving him in complete darkness. Suddenly, the lights flickered on and off. Jake could hear footsteps moving rapidly around the house now, not just in the kitchen, but upstairs, in the hallways everywhere. Doors slammed, windows rattled, and the whispering returned, a chorus of voices echoing his name over and over. "Jake, Jake, come to us." He scrambled to his feet and ran upstairs, trying to reach his room. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the whispers followed, closer and louder with every step. He locked the bedroom door behind him and pressed his back against it, trying to steady his breathing. The whispers didn't stop. A shadow appeared under the door, stretching unnaturally long across the floor. The whispering intensified, now clearly outside his room, circling him, penetrating the walls. "Jake, come, join us." The words twisted, almost tasting of malice. Jake looked around the room desperately, searching for something to defend himself. His eyes landed on a baseball bat in the corner. He grabbed it and waited, listening. The doorknob rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to break in. The shadow outside shifted, growing taller, darker. He swung the bat at the door, the wood connecting with a loud thud, and the shadow recoiled, disappearing into the hallway. He didn't stop. Jake ran to the window, yanking it open despite the pounding rain. Climbing out onto the porch, he slid down the wet steps and ran toward the street. Behind him, the house seemed alive, the laughter and whispers chasing him, echoing through the storm. When his parents returned the next day, Jake barely spoke. He didn't want to explain. He couldn't explain. The house seemed normal again, peaceful even. But Jake knew better. Every time he passed that street, he felt the house watching, waiting, as if it remembered him. Even years later, when Jake had moved across town into a modern apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Shadows in corners seemed a little too dark, whispers a little too close, and on stormy nights, he could still hear his name, softly carried on the wind. Jake. He never stayed home alone again. Story the end. It was a quiet Saturday evening when Mia found herself alone in her family's old farmhouse. Her parents had gone to a wedding in the next town over and left her in charge, promising to be back by late Sunday. Mia didn't mind. It was nice to have the house to herself for once. The farmhouse was isolated, surrounded by fields and dense woods, and the silence was something she had always found comforting. But tonight that silence felt wrong, heavy, and watchful. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea and scrolling on her phone when she heard it, a soft thump from upstairs. Mia froze, straining her ears. The farmhouse had always creaked, floors, walls, the old pipes, but this was different. This was deliberate, measured, like footsteps pacing across the hallway outside her parents' bedroom. "Probably just the house settling," she whispered to herself, though her voice sounded weak. She tried to focus on her phone, but the uneasy feeling refused to leave. The thumps continued, slow and steady, stopping and starting in an unnatural rhythm. Mia decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase, the beam shaking in her hand. At the top, the hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by the weak light from the windows. The air was colder here, and each step she took seemed to echo too loudly. When she reached the door to her parents' room, she paused. The handle was warm. Someone or something had touched it. Heart racing, she turned away and moved toward her own room at the end of the hall. The hallway seemed longer than usual, shadows stretching along the walls, twisting unnaturally. That's when she saw it, a figure at the far end of the hall, half hidden in the shadows. It was humanoid but featureless, darker than the surrounding darkness, as if the light couldn't touch it. Mia froze. The figure didn't move at first, just seemed to watch her, tilting its head slowly. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure vanished, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. Trembling, she rushed into her room and locked the door, pressing herself against it. Hours passed, or it felt like hours. Every creak, every whisper of the wind outside made her jump. Then she heard it, soft scratching, coming from the closet. Mia's hands shook as she gripped the doorknob. The scratching grew louder, accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whisper. "Mia, come out." Tears pricked her eyes. She backed into the corner, too afraid to move. The closet door slowly creaked open, though no one could be seen. A cold draft swept through the room, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The shadows in her room seemed to writhe, stretching toward her like fingers. Mia bolted from the room, running down the stairs, but the house seemed to shift around her. Hallways elongated, doors led to rooms that weren't there before, and every corner held a shadow that wasn't hers. She could hear footsteps chasing her, soft but deliberate, echoing from every direction. She reached the front door and yanked it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her. Windows were locked tight. The shadows pressed closer, and the whispers became a chorus, calling her name over and over. "Mia! Mia! Join us!" Desperate, she grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it at the nearest shadow. It dissipated with a hiss, leaving the air colder than before. but more shadows emerged, moving faster, circling her, pushing her back toward the staircase. She ran up to the attic, hoping to hide, and slammed the trapdoor behind her. In the attic, the darkness was absolute. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, pressing against her mind, filling her with a sense of dread she had never known. She could feel the shadows moving just beneath the floorboards, stretching and writhing toward her. Then she saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of tiny glowing eyes, staring from the corners of the room. The whispers became voices, speaking in unison. "Mia, you can't hide. We are here." She screamed, covering her ears, trying to block out the sound. And then, just as suddenly as it began, silence. The darkness seemed to recede, and the attic returned to normal. Sunlight began to filter through the small attic window. Mia collapsed onto the floor, shaking, unable to move. When her parents returned the next day, the farmhouse was quiet and still, exactly as it had always been. Mia didn't speak of the night to anyone, but she knew what had happened. The house was alive in ways she could not explain, and whatever had haunted her that night had not entirely left. Years later, Mia could still feel it. In moments of solitude, when she was home alone, shadows seemed darker, corners sharper, and the faint whisper of her name could sometimes be heard just at the edge of perception. "Mia, we're still here." She never stayed alone in a house again. Story the end. It was the middle of winter in a small town in Pennsylvania when 17-year-old Jake Thompson ended up alone in his family home. His parents had gone to visit his grandmother out of state, leaving him with strict instructions to stay home, feed the dog, and keep the heat on. Jake wasn't thrilled, but the idea of a whole house to himself sounded freeing. He spent the first evening playing video games, listening to music, and ordering Chinese food. The house was old, built in the 1920s, with narrow hallways, high ceilings, and creaky wooden floors that groaned under the slightest movement. He knew every squeak and crack, or at least he thought he did. Around 10:30 p.m., as Jake walked from the kitchen back to the living room, he heard it. A faint scratching sound from the attic above. The house had an attic that no one went into. His parents kept it locked and said it was just for storage. He ignored it, assuming it was a squirrel or the house settling, but the scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Goosebumps rose on his arms. He called out jokingly, "Okay, seriously, if there's a raccoon, I'm coming up there." Silence followed. Then, just as he turned back toward the living room, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending the attic stairs, slow, heavy, deliberate. Jake froze. No one else was supposed to be home. He reached for his phone. Dead. He tried the charger in the living room, also dead. Something about the sudden power failure made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Then he heard it again, a soft whisper, low and hoarse, coming from the direction of the hallway. "Jake." His pulse raced. He shined a flashlight down the hallway. The beam landed on the staircase leading to the attic door. It was slightly ajar, moving as if pushed by an invisible hand. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, distorted, almost like a dozen voices speaking at once. "Come, come, stay, never leave." The air turned cold, and his breath fogged the beam of the flashlight. Against his better judgment, Jake climbed the stairs to the attic. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, musty, and unnaturally cold. Boxes and old furniture were stacked haphazardly, but nothing appeared to have moved until the flashlight caught it. The outline of a small figure crouched in the corner, staring at him. Its eyes were completely black, hollow. Its skin was grayish, almost translucent, and it smiled without moving its lips. Jake stumbled back. The figure whispered again, "You shouldn't be here." Heart pounding, Jake ran down the stairs, the flashlight swinging wildly. The house seemed to change around him, the hallway elongated, shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally. He ran to the living room, then to the front door, only to find it locked tight, as if it had fused with the frame. Panic gripped him. The scratching sound returned, closer, circling the house, echoing through the walls. Jake grabbed a kitchen knife, ready to defend himself, and ran toward the basement. He remembered there was another exit down there, an old side door leading to the backyard. As he descended the stairs, the temperature plummeted. The flashlight flickered, then went out. In the darkness, he heard whispers all around him, dozens of voices, overlapping, unintelligible, but all calling his name. A sudden movement made him scream. A shadow lunged at him from the far end of the basement. He swung the knife, and it passed through nothing but cold air. The shadow dissolved into a low mist, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He reached the side door and flung it open. Cold wind slammed into his face as he ran into the snow-covered backyard. He didn't stop until he reached his neighbor's house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. They called the police. When the officers arrived and returned with him to the house, it was silent. The attic was empty, the basement still. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow from inside the house, nothing. Just the cold and the lingering sense that something had been there. The officers suggested it might have been a nightmare or stress-induced hallucinations. But Jake knew what he had seen. Over the next few weeks, he noticed strange things. Lights flickering without explanation, whispers in empty rooms, cold drafts that followed him from room to room. One night, while staying awake to avoid being alone, he found a small piece of paper on his bed. Written in messy, childlike handwriting were the words, "We see you. We are waiting." Jake's fear never left. He moved out for college, but every house he stayed in after that felt wrong. Shadows seemed to follow him, whispers echoed in quiet moments, and he often woke up to the feeling of someone sitting at the edge of his bed. He never discovered who or what it was, but he knew the truth. The house in Pennsylvania had marked him, and whatever had been in that attic was not finished with him. Years later, whenever he returned to his hometown, he would drive past that old house, now boarded up. Sometimes in the windows he thought he could see shapes moving, figures watching him, waiting. And late at night he would hear the faint whisper of his name on the wind. Jake. Story the end. It was one of those crisp October evenings in the Midwest when the leaves had already turned fiery shades of orange and red, and the wind carried a chill that felt almost alive. Emily had just turned 17 and had been left home alone for the weekend while her parents drove to Chicago for a relative's wedding. At first, she was thrilled. Finally, the freedom of a whole house to herself. She settled in with her laptop, some snacks, and a stack of horror novels she'd been meaning to read. By 7 o'clock, the sun had dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in shadows. Emily's parents had gone over the house rules a dozen times. Don't answer the door, lock all the windows, and call them if anything felt off. She reassured herself she was careful. After all, the neighborhood was quiet, and the closest neighbors were a good half-mile away. Still, as she curled up in the living room with a blanket, she felt a subtle unease. It wasn't anything specific, just the kind of feeling that crawled up your spine when the house was too quiet. About an hour later, Emily heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails against the window. Her heart leapt. She froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped. Shaking her head, she told herself it was just the wind. Still, she couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. She tried to lose herself in a book, but every creak of the floorboards or sigh of the wind made her jump. Around 9, she went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. The hallway was pitch black, lit only by the dim glow of the fridge. As she passed the staircase leading to the basement, she thought she saw movement. Just a flicker, a shadow that darted behind the railing. She paused. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. She shook her head again and took the water, trying to convince herself she was imagining things. Later, while scrolling on her phone, Emily noticed the power flicker. The overhead lights went dim for a second, then returned. "Okay," she muttered, "definitely just the storm outside." But no storm had been forecasted. Outside, the sky was clear. She shrugged it off and went upstairs to her bedroom. She had just settled in when she heard it again, a soft scratching, this time from the attic. Her parents' house had a small pull-down ladder leading to the attic, and she'd never been up there alone. She debated ignoring it, but curiosity, tinged with a hint of fear, won. She crept downstairs, each step making her stomach twist. The sound stopped as she reached the bottom, leaving only the house's silence and her own heavy breathing. She stood under the attic ladder and looked up. There was nothing there, at least nothing she could see, just cobwebs and dust. Still, she could have sworn she'd heard whispering. Emily tried to rationalize it. Maybe a branch tapped the side of the house, or maybe it was just her mind playing tricks. But as she turned back toward the stairs, a cold draft hit her. even though all the windows were closed. It made her skin crawl. She shivered and bolted upstairs, locking her bedroom door behind her. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, and tried to calm down. The house, after all, had always been quiet at night. Nothing bad had ever happened. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time it was footsteps, not the creaks of the house settling, but real footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing from the kitchen to the living room. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, but before she could press call, the footsteps stopped. Silence returned. Her thumb hovered over the call button as she listened. Then the faintest whisper, "Emily?" Her blood ran cold. She froze. That was definitely her name. She couldn't see anyone, and the whisper didn't come from anywhere in particular. It felt as if it came from all around her. Trembling, she whispered back, "Who's there?" Nothing. The room remained deathly still, and the shadows cast by the streetlight outside seemed to twist unnaturally against the walls. Suddenly, her bedroom door clicked, once sharply, and began to slowly creak open. Emily yanked it closed and locked it, fumbling with the handle until she heard a snap. It was locked. Safe? For now. She backed into her bed and pulled the blanket over her head, but the whispering continued, growing slightly louder, almost chanting, "Emily, come downstairs." She didn't want to, but the voice was compelling, insistent, like a tide pulling her against her will. She stayed in bed, shaking, trying to tell herself it was a dream or her imagination. Hours passed like that, each minute stretching endlessly. Every time she tried to doze off, she would hear it again. The footsteps, the whispering, the faint scratching from the attic. She couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, she heard a sudden bang from the kitchen, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Emily froze, every instinct screaming at her to stay put. She wanted to call her parents, but her fingers were trembling too much. Then she saw it, at the edge of her doorway, a shadow. It didn't have a definite shape like someone she could recognize. It was tall, amorphous, and seemed to flicker like smoke. The room temperature dropped drastically, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Emily backed into the corner of her room, clutching a baseball bat she kept under her bed. The shadow didn't move at first. It just hovered as if studying her. Then it slowly started gliding toward her, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Emily, come, come." Her terror reached a breaking point. She swung the bat, but it passed right through the shadow. It recoiled, almost like a living thing, but intangible, and suddenly all the lights in the house went out. Pitch black. She screamed and ran for her phone, fumbling in the dark. She managed to get a flashlight app on and shined it around. The living room was empty, but she could see all the furniture had shifted. Chairs were overturned and the dining table seemed to have been dragged across the floor. Then she saw the attic ladder slowly descending, as if an invisible hand was pulling it down. Emily's legs felt like lead. She wanted to run, but every exit she tried seemed blocked. Doors that should have opened wouldn't budge, and windows that had been unlocked earlier were now tightly shut. And then she heard it again. This time, laughter. Low, chilling, inhuman. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves, bouncing around the room in a way that made it impossible to locate the source. Emily stumbled backward into the hallway, tripping over the rug, and as she fell, she saw something impossible. Her own reflection in the hallway mirror, but not quite right. Her eyes were black, empty, and her mouth was stretched into a grimace she hadn't made. She scrambled away, breathing heavily, feeling the shadow draw closer, as if it could sense her fear and feed off it. She ran to the kitchen, thinking maybe she could barricade herself there. But when she flipped the switch, the lights flickered and went out again. In the darkness, she could feel the presence behind her, moving with unnatural silence. And then she felt it. A hand, cold, icy, brushing against her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the whispering returned, this time forming words she could barely comprehend. "It's time." Emily realized she couldn't stay. She had to get out. Summoning all her courage, she ran to the back door and tried to open it. Locked. She rattled it, panicking, then remembered the basement. Maybe the back basement door led outside. She sprinted down the narrow stairs, each step groaning under her weight. The basement smelled of mildew and rust, damp and cold. She saw the door leading to the backyard, but as she reached it, the shadow appeared again. This time it was larger, darker, moving faster. Emily screamed and slammed herself against the door. Somehow it gave way and she tumbled outside onto the wet grass. She didn't stop to look back. She ran across the yard, across the street, and didn't stop until she reached the neighbor's porch, pounding on the door until Mr. Thompson, an elderly man, opened it. Breathless and shaking, she could barely speak, finally managing, something's in the house. The neighbor called the police, and when they arrived, they found the house in disarray. Furniture overturned, the attic ladder down, and strange symbols scratched deep into the wood of the staircase railing, shapes Emily had never seen before. But there was no sign of anyone else, no intruder, nothing that could explain the chaos, and no trace of the shadow. Emily's parents returned the next day, and she tried to explain, but they thought it was just her imagination running wild. But when they went into the basement, the same icy chill hit them, and Emily pointed to the staircase railing. The symbols were still there, etched deeply into the wood, something that had not been there before. Emily moved out of that house a few weeks later. The experience left her jumpy, always feeling watched, even in crowded rooms. The new owners eventually moved in, and locals whispered about the haunted house on Maple Street, saying strange things happened there at night. Some claimed to hear whispers calling their names, shadows moving in the corners, doors opening and closing by themselves. Emily never forgot the cold hand on her shoulder or the whispering that still echoed in her mind. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake up and hear it again. Her name, carried on a voice that wasn't quite human. And she knew, somewhere, the shadow still lingered in that house, waiting for the next person left alone to hear it call. Story the end. It was a chilly November evening when Tyler found himself alone in the old family house. His parents had gone out of town for a weekend trip, leaving him to stay behind. At 17, he was excited by the idea of having the house to himself, movies, snacks, and loud music without anyone telling him to turn it down. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the living room, a creeping unease settled over him. Tyler was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone when he first heard it. A faint tapping from the hallway outside the living room. At first, he ignored it, blaming the old house's tendency to settle and creak. But then came the whispering, soft and deliberate, so faint he thought he might be imagining it. Tyler. He froze. His fingers tightened around the phone. The voice had a strange echo to it, almost as if it came from everywhere at once. He tried calling out, "Hello?" but his voice sounded tinny, swallowed by the walls. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural. Curiosity, or perhaps fear-driven recklessness, pushed him to investigate. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the hallway. The wooden floors groaned beneath his weight, each step echoing too loudly in the empty house. The beam of light from his phone flickered, illuminating nothing unusual, just doors closed, shadows stretching along the walls. Then he saw it. At the end of the hall, near his parents' bedroom, a dark shape lingered. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the hallway lamp. But it moved, or at least it seemed to pulse, darker than the surrounding darkness. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest. He swallowed hard and stepped closer. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice trembling. The shape didn't respond, but tilted slightly, like a head, and for a split second, Tyler thought he saw glowing eyes. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished. He bolted back to the living room, thinking the sighting must have been a hallucination brought on by nerves. But as he tried to settle back on the couch, the sounds started again. A slow, dragging noise came from upstairs, followed by a low, guttural laugh that wasn't human, echoing off the walls. Tyler's pulse raced. He grabbed a kitchen knife and climbed the stairs, reasoning that maybe he'd confront whatever it was. But the house seemed alive now. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows stretched along the walls like reaching fingers. The laughter followed him, circling, slipping through cracks under the doors. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw it again, a figure at the end of the hallway, taller than a man, darker than night, completely featureless except for two dimly glowing eyes. Tyler froze. The figure tilted its head slowly, and the air around him seemed to thicken, pressing down on his chest. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice breaking. The figure didn't move toward him, Instead, it faded, dissolving into the darkness. The hallway returned to stillness, but Tyler knew it wasn't gone. He felt its presence pressing against him, watching him from every corner. Desperate, he ran back to his room and locked the door. He pressed his back to it, clutching the knife, listening. Footsteps moved in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, then stopped. Then came a whisper, so soft he could barely hear it. Tyler. The whisper became a chant, a chorus of voices calling his name. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows crawling along the floor toward him. He banged on the door, screaming, but no sound of help came. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, at dawn, the house returned to normal. The shadows retreated, the whispers faded, and the air warmed slightly. Tyler didn't sleep. He sat in his room, pale and trembling, waiting for his parents to return. When they arrived, everything was normal. Nothing disturbed, just the ordinary house. But Tyler knew what he had experienced. Whatever it was, it had marked him. Years later, he would still flinch at shadows, jump at noises, and sometimes, late at night, hear his name whispered faintly as if carried on the wind. He never stayed alone in that house again. Story the end. The first time Tyler was left alone in his family's old farmhouse, he didn't think much of it. His parents had to go out of town for a funeral in another state, leaving him, a 16-year-old who usually enjoyed solitude, in charge for the weekend. The house had been in the family for generations, out in rural Pennsylvania, far from any neighbors, and surrounded by acres of overgrown woods. Tyler liked it quiet. He liked being alone. But there was something about that house, the way it creaked and groaned even in calm weather, that made him uneasy. The first evening passed quietly. He ate leftovers, watched a couple of movies, and even called his friends just to brag about being alone for the first time. Around 10:30, though, he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. He froze, thinking maybe it was the wind or a raccoon. But then came a knock, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" Tyler called, his voice a little shaky. No answer. He peeked out the window. The porch was empty. The chill in the air seemed unnatural, but he shook it off, blaming nerves and the autumn chill. He went upstairs to his room, locking the door behind him. The house was silent for a while. Then came the scratching. It was soft at first, like nails dragging across wood coming from the attic. Tyler's room was right below it. He sat on the bed, listening, the hair on the back of his neck standing straight up. The scratching stopped, and he relaxed, until a whisper reached his ears. Tyler. He thought he imagined it. He told himself he was just tired, hearing things. But the whisper came again, closer this time, almost inside his head. "Tyler, come downstairs." Tyler swallowed hard. He didn't want to go. But something about the voice, hollow and chilling, compelled him. He grabbed his flashlight and crept to the stairs. The house was dark, the only light from the moon streaming through the tall windows. As he descended, the air grew colder, and he could see his breath. When he reached the bottom step, the whispering stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against his ears. Then a noise, a low, dragging sound came from the living room. He pointed the flashlight in that direction. Nothing. He took a cautious step forward, and the noise stopped. Another step, and he felt a sudden icy wind brush past him. His flashlight flickered, and in the brief shadows, he thought he saw a figure, tall, thin, with eyes reflecting the moonlight. It wasn't human, not exactly. He blinked, and it vanished. Heart hammering, Tyler backed toward the stairs. That's when the front door slammed, echoing through the house. The sound of something moving, dragging along the floor, came from the kitchen. Tyler ran back upstairs, slamming his door and locking it, but the sound followed, or seemed to. Scratches on the walls, the whispering again, "Tyler, it's here." Tyler's mind raced. He had read stories online about poltergeists, about spirits that lingered where people had died violently or where families had suffered. He tried to calm himself, tried to reason it away, but then he remembered the old journals his grandfather had kept in the attic, stories about the house, unexplained disappearances, and a warning never to be alone after dark. He hadn't believed them, not really. Now he wished he had. The hours dragged. Every creak, every thump, every faint whisper made him jump. Around 2 a.m., he heard a voice, clear and close. "Tyler, downstairs." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a command. Against his better judgment, driven by terror and curiosity, he grabbed his flashlight and tiptoed downstairs. The living room was empty, but the temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed along the window sills. He could hear breathing, shallow, almost as if someone or something was right behind him. Tyler spun around. The figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was faint, shadow-like, its shape human but wrong. Its eyes were black holes, its mouth stretched unnaturally. And then it moved, fast, impossibly fast, toward him. He stumbled backward, tripping over the rug, crashing into the coffee table. The flashlight rolled away, illuminating the room in fleeting bursts of light. He saw walls scratched with words, "Leave before it comes." Tyler scrambled to the back door, but it wouldn't budge. Windows that had been unlocked were now sealed shut. He could hear it behind him, the whispering turning into laughter, low and hollow, echoing around the room. Panicked, he remembered the cellar door in the kitchen. There was an old storm exit down there that led outside. He ran toward it, the laughter growing louder. He reached the cellar, slammed the door open, and climbed down the narrow steps, cold stone walls pressed against him. The exit was just ahead, and he pushed as hard as he could. The door gave way, and he tumbled outside onto the wet grass. Behind him, he could hear the laughter still, faint now, but following him as he ran through the dark fields. Tyler didn't stop until he reached the main road, where a neighbor's house finally offered safety. The police were called, and though they searched the house, they found nothing unusual except for the scratches on the walls and a series of footprints in the dust of the living room, which seemed to vanish at the threshold of the hallway. There was no sign of an intruder, nothing that could explain the terror he had experienced. His parents returned the next day. And though they were concerned, they tried to reassure him it was just stress and imagination. But Tyler knew better. The journals in the attic had warned about the spirit that haunted the house, a presence that thrived on fear and isolation. He moved out a few weeks later, unable to shake the feeling of being followed, of unseen eyes watching him even in crowded places. Years later, Tyler still hears whispers sometimes, soft, echoing, calling his name. He knows the figure he saw in the living room was real, that it still lurks in that house, waiting for the next person foolish enough to be left alone in the dark. And somewhere in the shadows of that old farmhouse, the thing waits, patient and hungry. Story, the end. It was late October in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon when 24-year-old Megan Walters agreed to house sit for her aunt. Her aunt's Victorian-style home sat on the edge of a small wooded area, surrounded by towering pines and an empty field that stretched toward the horizon. The place always looked beautiful during the day, sunlight filtering through the trees, the house glowing with warmth. But at night, it was another world entirely. Her aunt had warned her about noises in the house. "It creaks a lot when the wind picks up," she'd said with a laugh. Megan didn't think much of it. She had just graduated college, and the idea of a few quiet nights in a big old house with a stocked fridge sounded peaceful. That first night, she settled in with a glass of wine and a movie, wrapped in a blanket on the couch. Around midnight, she heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. Slow, steady, unmistakable. She muted the TV and listened. The steps went from one end of the hall to the other, then stopped. Her heart quickened. She told herself it was just the house settling. It was old, after all. But when she heard it again, louder this time, followed by a faint dragging sound, the explanation didn't hold up. Megan grabbed her phone and called out, "Hello?" Her voice echoed through the house. No answer. She forced herself to stand, picked up a flashlight from the kitchen, and began to climb the staircase. The air felt heavier with every step. When she reached the landing, the light flickered, casting long, quivering shadows along the walls. She checked each room, guest room, storage, office. Nothing. But when she opened the door to the last bedroom, she froze. The air inside was freezing cold, her breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The window was open, curtains blowing gently, even though she was certain she had closed all of them earlier. She shut the window quickly and turned to leave, but something caught her eye. A set of footprints on the dusty wooden floor. Small footprints, like a child's, leading from the center of the room to the closet door. Her stomach turned. There were no children in the house. She crouched to inspect them. They were clear, as if someone barefoot had walked through dust moments ago. Then, from inside the closet, came a soft, slow knock. 3 times. She backed up, flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who's there?" she whispered. Silence. Then the knock again, slower this time, deliberate. Her breath hitched and the light began to flicker harder. She reached for the doorknob and, before she could stop herself, yanked the closet door open. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint smell of damp wood. But as she shined the flashlight inside, she saw it, faint writing scratched into the wall. "Let me out." The letters looked old, carved deep into the wood. A chill ran through her body. She backed away, slammed the door shut, and practically ran downstairs. For hours, she sat in the living room, trying to calm herself, trying to reason it out. But the house wouldn't let her rest. Around 2 a.m., she heard something new, a soft, childlike humming coming from upstairs. It was faint but unmistakable, like a lullaby. The same melody repeated over and over again. Then a voice, small, delicate, began to whisper between verses. "It's so cold. Help me." Megan's skin went cold. She turned on every light in the house, but the humming continued, now echoing faintly through the vents. She covered her ears, trying to block it out. Then from behind her, she heard it again, this time right next to her ear. "Megan!" she screamed and spun around. No one there. But when she looked toward the reflection in the window, she saw something standing behind her. A small figure, a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, pale, dressed in a faded nightgown. Her hair was stringy and dark, her face partly obscured by shadow. Megan dropped the flashlight. When she turned around, the figure was gone. Only the curtains swayed slightly, though the air in the room was still. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, and for a brief moment, Megan thought she might have dreamed it all. She laughed nervously at herself, made coffee, and convinced herself it had just been nerves, loneliness, and too much imagination. But when she glanced down at the kitchen table, she froze. In the thin layer of dust that had settled overnight, small handprints trailed across the surface. She called her aunt, voice shaking, and asked if anything strange had ever happened in the house. There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, her aunt said quietly, "That house used to belong to another family before us. Their daughter, she died in that house. Fell down the stairs one winter night. She was only 9. Megan's blood ran cold. Her name was Annie, her aunt added. Sometimes, I think she still walks there. That night, Megan didn't want to sleep, but exhaustion won. She woke up sometime after 3 a.m. to the sound of soft crying outside her door, the kind of heartbreaking, muffled sobs that sounded almost human. She sat up slowly, heart pounding, and listened. The crying grew louder. "Megan," the small voice whispered again, "please help me." Terrified, she opened the door just a crack. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the nightlight at the far end. She stepped out cautiously, calling softly, "Annie?" The crying stopped. For a few seconds, the house was utterly still. Then, from behind her, the bedroom door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Megan screamed and ran toward the stairs, but halfway down she stopped dead in her tracks. A figure stood at the bottom. The same small girl, pale and cold, her head tilted slightly, her eyes hollow. She reached out a hand and whispered, "Don't leave me again." Then, in an instant, she was gone. Megan collapsed onto the stairs, sobbing, trembling uncontrollably. The lights flickered, and she could hear the girl's voice echoing softly through the walls, as if coming from every direction. "You promised you'd help me." When morning came, the house was silent again. Megan packed her things and left without looking back. Her aunt later told her that after Megan left, strange things started happening again. Doors opening on their own, toys moving across the floor, and at night, the faint sound of a child humming could be heard drifting down from the upstairs hall. Megan never went back. She still dreams of the girl sometimes, standing in the corner of her room, whispering her name in that soft, broken voice. And every time Megan wakes up, she finds small footprints in the dust near her bed, as if something or someone has found her again. Story the end. It was a cold, foggy evening in rural Wisconsin when Emma, 16, found herself home alone in her family's old farmhouse. Her parents had driven to Milwaukee for a weekend wedding, leaving her with the creaky 2-story house, narrow hallways, and the attic she had always been too scared to enter. Emma had stayed alone before, but tonight the air felt heavier, as if the house itself were breathing around her. The evening began quietly. Emma snacked on leftovers, watched TV, and messaged friends about being home alone. Around 9, she heard a faint tapping at the back door. At first, she assumed it was the wind rattling the old windows, but the tapping continued, slow, deliberate, almost like someone was testing her. Heart pounding, she peered through the glass. Nothing, only the dark yard, fog settling over the trees. Trying to calm herself, Emma went upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door, but the house refused to stay quiet. Scratches began along the hallway walls outside her room, soft at first, then louder, like nails dragged across wood. Then came a whisper, low and guttural. Emma. Her stomach sank. The voice wasn't her parents', it wasn't anyone she knew. The whisper came again, closer, coaxing, "Come downstairs." Fear battled curiosity, but Emma's instincts forced her to act. Trembling, she grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs. The temperature dropped sharply, and her breath appeared in the air like smoke. In the living room, the flashlight revealed a dark, flickering shadow in the corner. It was tall, thin, formless. Its edges wavered like smoke, pressing against her with a suffocating weight. She tried to back away, but the staircase seemed to stretch endlessly behind her. The shadow glided silently toward her. Panicked, Emma bolted to the kitchen, searching desperately for an exit. The back door was locked, the windows sealed tight. The whispering turned into hollow laughter, echoing through the house. She felt an icy touch brush her shoulder, making her stumble. Desperate, she remembered the basement. A small storm door led outside. She ran down the narrow stairs, the shadow gliding silently behind her. Frost formed along the walls, and the whispering grew louder, almost chanting her name. She pushed the cellar door open and tumbled into the wet yard. Without stopping, she ran down the muddy driveway until she reached a neighbor's porch and pounded on the door, shivering and gasping. The neighbor called the police. When they investigated, they found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to explain Emma's terror. Yet the living room furniture had been shifted, and deep scratches were etched into the floors and walls in strange, unexplainable patterns. Her parents returned the next morning, attempting to reassure her it was her imagination. But Emma knew better. She had felt it. The whispers, the shadow, the icy presence that had haunted her. She moved out shortly afterward, never staying alone again. Even years later, Emma sometimes wakes in the middle of the night to faint whispers calling her name, or icy fingers brushing her shoulder when she's alone. The farmhouse still stands, mostly empty, but locals whisper that anyone left alone inside will hear footsteps, doors creaking and voices calling their name. Somewhere in the shadows it waits, patient, hungry, ready for the next person, foolish enough to be home alone. Story the end. It was a quiet evening in late October when 17-year-old Emily Turner found herself alone in her family's suburban home in Ohio. Her parents had left for a weekend trip to visit relatives in Kentucky, leaving her with a list of chores, a strict curfew, and the keys to the house. At first, Emily relished the solitude. She could watch whatever she wanted on TV, blast music, and cook whatever she pleased without someone hovering over her. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house seemed to grow colder, quieter, almost expectant. Emily was sitting on the living room couch, scrolling through her phone when she noticed the first oddity. The hallway light, which she was sure she had turned off, flickered faintly. She frowned and tapped it, thinking it was a bulb on its last legs. But when it flickered again, slower this time, she felt a small shiver run down her spine. Shaking it off, she returned to her phone, convincing herself it was nothing. By 9 p.m., she had finished dinner and was cleaning up the kitchen. She heard the sound of a door creaking, though the house was empty. "Must be the wind," she muttered aloud, but the tone in her own voice betrayed her doubt. The wind? It wasn't that strong. Not tonight. Around 10:30 p.m., Emily decided to call her best friend Jenna, just to chat. She told her about the flickering lights and the creaking doors, trying to make it sound casual, but Jenna laughed and told her she was imagining things. Emily laughed too, but her laughter died in her throat when the faint sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. "Jenna, I think someone's in the house," she whispered, barely moving the phone away from her ear. "Emily, it's probably just the house settling. Old houses do that," Jenna said, though her voice wavered slightly. Emily's eyes darted to the staircase leading to the second floor. The footsteps stopped. Her pulse quickened. "Yeah, maybe," she said, though her voice was barely audible. She ended the call, telling herself she was being paranoid. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the house carried an oppressive silence that made every small noise startling. At midnight, Emily was in her bedroom, lying under the covers and scrolling through her phone, when she heard it again, soft tapping at her window. She froze. Her room was on the first floor, and the backyard was dark and empty. She slowly crept to the window and pulled aside the curtain. Nothing. Trying to calm herself, Emily locked the window and returned to bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. But as she lay there, the tapping returned, this time from inside the room. She turned toward her dresser and saw it. A shadow, fleeting, almost humanoid, moving along the wall. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the door and tried to call her parents, but her phone displayed no signal. In a panic, she grabbed the landline, only to hear static. Then a whisper, so faint she almost didn't catch it. "Emily." Her head whipped around. No one was there. She bolted to the kitchen, thinking maybe the presence was more afraid of her than she was of it. But the kitchen was empty. Yet the air felt heavy, like she was being watched, like the house itself had eyes. The next morning, Emily tried to shake off the terror of the previous night. She told herself it was just stress, perhaps a nightmare fueled by the isolation. She went about her chores, but she noticed subtle signs that something wasn't right. Doors she had locked were slightly ajar, objects she remembered placing in one spot were moved, and the temperature in the house fluctuated dramatically. That evening, she tried to focus on a movie, but her eyes kept darting to shadows in the corners of the room. Around 8 p.m., she heard the faint sound of humming coming from the living room. Curious, she tiptoed toward it, but the sound stopped as soon as she entered. Her heartbeat was rapid, but she told herself she wasn't imagining it. Dinner was a quiet affair. As she was finishing her food, the lights flickered again. She sighed, thinking she'd call an electrician in the morning. Then she heard it, the soft thud of footsteps, this time on the stairs. They paused halfway. Emily's breath caught. She whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, just silence. Around 11 p.m., Emily was lying in bed again when she heard the soft scuffing of shoes across her carpet. She strained her ears. The noise came closer, stopping right outside her bedroom door. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Then the doorknob rattled. Frozen, she listened. The rattling stopped, but now came the whispering, just beneath the threshold of hearing. "Emily, come, see." Her rational mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She slowly got up, shaking, and opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick and cold. She took a step out, then another, until she reached the staircase. The whispers grew louder, unintelligible, almost urgent. The stairs groaned under her weight, but as she reached the landing, she saw it. A figure, pale and semi-transparent, standing at the end of the hall. Its features were indistinct, but she could feel its eyes on her. Emily stumbled backward, tripping over the carpet. The figure didn't move toward her, yet its presence was oppressive. The whispers intensified into a chorus of overlapping voices, saying her name, laughing, crying, pleading. Terrified, Emily ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the night. She ran to her neighbor's house, pounding on the door. "Mr. Henderson," an elderly man, opened it, blinking at her frantic state. They're in the house," she screamed. "Something's in the house." Mr. Henderson, puzzled, followed her back. They entered cautiously, but the house was quiet, still. Nothing moved, no flickering lights, no shadows. The air was normal, warm even. Emily was shaking violently, insisting she had seen something. Mr. Henderson tried to calm her. "Maybe it was a dream, Emily. You've been alone for 2 nights. It's stressful. Let's check everything just to be safe." They walked through the house, checking rooms. Everything was in place, nothing unusual, until they reached Emily's bedroom. On her dresser, written in faint, almost translucent letters, was a single word, "Leave." Emily's hands trembled. I didn't write that," she stammered. Mr. Henderson frowned, but before he could speak, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath was visible in the sudden cold. The lights flickered, and the whispering returned, this time all around them, rising to an ear-splitting cacophony. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows bending unnaturally. Emily screamed and grabbed Mr. Henderson's arm. The voices called her name again, now urgently, desperately. Then, abruptly, the noises stopped. The lights stabilized, the cold receded, and the house returned to normal. Emily's parents returned the next day, finding her exhausted and pale, refusing to speak of what had happened. When they asked about the strange occurrences, Mr. Henderson merely shook his head, offering no explanation. That night, Emily tried to sleep, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she noticed a shadow flitting across the wall, subtle, fleeting. She held her breath, telling herself it was her imagination. Then she heard it again, a faint whisper, just behind her ear, saying, "Emily." From that day on, she never felt truly alone in the house. Lights flickered randomly, doors sometimes opened on their own, and occasionally, in the dead of night, the faintest sound of footsteps would echo through the halls. Sometimes she would wake to find objects move just slightly, in ways that made no sense. Over the years, the presence never became violent, never made itself fully known, but Emily always knew it was there. Watching, waiting, always whispering her name when she was alone. Friends asked her to move, but she couldn't leave the house she had grown up in. She learned to live with it, to accept it as part of her reality. Yet every now and then, when she was alone, she would feel that cold weight in the air, the whispered voice calling her, and a chilling certainty that she was never, ever alone. And sometimes, late at night, she would see it again, just a shadow at the end of the hall, watching, patient, and waiting for the next moment she was vulnerable. Story, the end. It was a rainy Friday night when Sophie found herself alone in her family's suburban home. Her parents had gone out to attend a late-night charity event, leaving her in charge. Normally, she enjoyed the quiet solitude, but tonight, the house felt different. The walls seemed to press in, and even the familiar creaks of the old wooden floors sounded sharper, more deliberate. Sophie was sitting on the couch, a blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, scrolling through her phone when she heard it. A soft, deliberate knock from the kitchen. She froze, listening. The storm outside had been fierce, rain hammering the windows, so she tried to brush it off as the wind. But then came another knock, this one from the living room. A soft scrape accompanied it, like someone dragging their fingers across the floor. Her heart began to race. "Mom? Dad?" "Dad," she called out, voice shaking. Silence answered. She tried rationalizing. Maybe a branch had fallen outside, maybe the cat had knocked something over, but deep down, she knew it wasn't ordinary. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously walked toward the kitchen. The air grew colder as she stepped through the hallway, each floorboard creaking loudly beneath her feet. When she reached the kitchen, everything looked normal. The fridge hummed, the sink was empty, and the chairs were neatly tucked under the table. But then she noticed it, the kitchen window, slightly ajar. She was sure she had closed it. Sophie moved to shut it, and that's when she felt it. A cold draft that wasn't from the rain, brushing past her like icy fingers. She spun around, flashlight beam sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. Then she heard it. A whisper. Faint, soft, but unmistakable. "Sophie." Her breath caught. The voice seemed to come from all directions at once. She backed away toward the hallway, and the whisper repeated a little closer. "Sophie." Panicked, she ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door, pressing her back against it. The house seemed alive now, every creak and groan amplified, echoing like a warning. Then she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing just outside her door. The whispering grew louder, joined by another sound, scratching. Something was scratching at the walls, moving closer and closer. Sophie's hands shook as she grabbed a heavy lamp, prepared to defend herself. The doorknob rattled violently, and a shadow stretched across the hallway outside her room, tall, dark, and shifting unnaturally. "Who's there?" she screamed, voice cracking. The shadow paused, then slowly moved away, disappearing into the corner of the hallway. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. The whispers continued, faint now but persistent, and the temperature in her room dropped sharply. Hours passed, or so it seemed. When morning finally came, the house returned to normal. The windows were closed, the doors locked, and the shadows gone. Sophie didn't speak of the night to anyone, but she knew what had happened. Something in the house had noticed her, something that hadn't left. Even years later, when Sophie had moved to a modern apartment, she could feel it. Shadows seemed too dark, corners too deep, and every so often when she was alone, she would hear her name whispered faintly on the wind. "Sophie, we're still here." She never stayed home alone again. Story, the the end. It was a rainy Friday evening in Vermont when 19-year-old Tyler Brooks found himself alone in his parents' lake house. His parents had left early that morning for a weekend business retreat, and Tyler had promised to stay behind to take care of the place. And secretly, he'd been excited to have the house all to himself. The lake was quiet, shrouded in mist, and the trees around the property seemed black and looming in the fading daylight. Tyler didn't mind. He liked the solitude. By 8 p.m., he had unpacked his laptop, stacked snacks on the coffee table, and settled into the living room with a horror movie marathon. Outside, the rain tapped rhythmically against the windows. Around 10:15, a sudden knock echoed through the house. Tyler froze. The only people who knew he was home were his parents, and they wouldn't return until Sunday. He cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The rain made it hard to see, but there was no one there. Shrugging it off, Tyler closed the door and returned to the couch. Moments later, another knock, this time louder, more insistent. His stomach tightened. He opened the door again. Still nothing. He checked the porch, the yard, even the dock that extended into the lake. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But when he turned back inside, he noticed something strange. The doorknob had small scratches around it, as if someone had been trying to force it. Tyler tried to laugh it off, but unease settled in. He turned the lights on and moved to the kitchen to get a glass of water. That's when he heard it, soft, dragging footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, moving from the master bedroom down the hall. Tyler froze. He knew he was alone, or thought he was. He grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the staircase. The beam of light revealed nothing at first. The house seemed empty. But as he stepped closer, he saw it. A dark shadow moving along the upper hallway. It didn't walk. It glided, almost floating. Tyler's hands shook as he whispered, "Hello? Who's there?" The shadow paused and then vanished. Tyler's heart pounded. He ran to the living room and bolted the doors, sliding a chair against the front door for extra measure. The house was old, with thin walls, so every sound seemed amplified, the wind rattling the windows, the rain hammering the roof. He tried calling his parents. No signal. The Wi-Fi was out. Around midnight, he heard something new. Soft giggling, like a child playing hide-and-seek, coming from the hallway. The sound circled the living room, moving closer and closer. Tyler grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands slick with sweat, and called out, "Stop! I'm alone." The giggling stopped. Then came the whisper, "Tyler, come play." The voice was faint, high-pitched, almost metallic. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, correct, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He swung the knife around the room, but nothing was there. Then he noticed it, writing on the wall across from the couch, appearing as if etched by a finger in frost. "I see you. Don't sleep." Tyler's panic escalated. He decided he had to leave, but when he approached the front door, it wouldn't budge. The locks hadn't jammed before. He slammed on the door repeatedly. Then he heard a dragging sound behind him. He spun around. The living room was empty, or so he thought, until he noticed the figure standing near the fireplace. Pale, thin, impossibly still, its head tilted at a wrong angle. Its eyes were dark holes staring straight at him. Frozen in terror, Tyler watched as it began moving toward him, slowly, deliberately. He swung the knife, but it passed through the figure like smoke. The room became colder, darker. Whispers filled the air, echoing from the walls, ceiling, and floor simultaneously. They said things he couldn't understand, yet the tone was threatening, possessive. In a desperate bid, Tyler ran upstairs, hoping to escape to a bedroom. The steps creaked ominously, and the shadow followed, gliding just behind him. He barricaded himself in one of the guest bedrooms, blocking the door with a dresser. Through the keyhole, he could see shadows moving along the hallway walls. The whispers grew louder, now almost intelligible. "You can't leave. You're mine." Hours passed. Exhaustion overtook him, but he dared not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel a cold presence hovering above him. The whispering didn't stop. At one point, the door handle rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to break in. Tyler held his breath, clutching the knife, waiting. By dawn, the storm outside subsided. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, and the house seemed calm again. Tyler cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, but when he glanced down the staircase, he froze. Small handprints were smeared in the dust on each step, leading from the living room up to his bedroom. None of them belonged to him. He ran to the car and didn't look back. His parents returned later that day, oblivious to what had happened. Tyler didn't tell them. How could he? They wouldn't believe him. That night, in his own apartment, he woke up to the feeling of cold fingers brushing his face and a faint whisper. "You left too soon." Tyler never stayed alone in a house again. Even now, years later, he avoids old houses, especially ones near woods or lakes. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, or when he's walking past a dark window, he swears he sees a pale figure standing still, watching, waiting. And he knows, no matter how far he goes, it's still following him, still whispering his name. Story the end. It was a Friday evening in late November when Maddie found herself alone in her family's home outside of Denver. Her parents had left for a weekend trip to visit relatives, leaving her in charge. She was 16, independent, and a little thrilled at the idea of being home alone. The house was old, a sprawling two-story with creaking floors, narrow hallways, and an attic she had never dared explore. Maddie had always loved the history of the house, the way the wooden floors whispered stories from decades past, but tonight, that charm felt ominous. At first, the evening was normal. She watched TV, ordered a pizza, and scrolled through her phone. Around 9:00, she noticed the lights flicker. Just for a second, nothing major, and she told herself it was probably the storm moving in outside. But the storm never arrived. Then came the sound, a soft tapping from the kitchen window. She froze. The sound stopped. She convinced herself it was a branch or a raccoon, yet her stomach tightened with unease. Later, while brushing her teeth before bed, she heard footsteps in the hallway behind her. Maddie spun around. Nobody was there. The house was quiet. She shrugged nervously and went to her bedroom, locking the door. But the noises didn't stop. Soft scratches along the baseboards, faint whispers she couldn't quite understand. Her bedroom door creaked, and she swore she saw it move slightly, as if someone or something was pressing against it. Maddie pulled the blankets over her head, trying to convince herself it was nothing, but sleep didn't come. Around midnight, she heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving in the living room. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Her heart raced. She grabbed her phone to call her parents, but the screen went black. The footsteps stopped. Maddie held her breath. Then a voice, low and guttural, whispered her name, "Maddie." Terrified, she sat frozen on the bed. She thought about the stories she had read of poltergeists, restless spirits, things that didn't want to be disturbed. She told herself she had to stay calm, but every instinct screamed for her to run. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Downstairs, now." She forced herself out of bed, flashlight in hand. Her steps were slow, deliberate, shaking as she descended the stairs. The living room was empty, but the air was freezing. Frost had begun to form along the windowsills, though there had been no storm. Then she saw it, a shadow, tall and indistinct, flickering at the edge of her vision. It wasn't quite human, yet it had a presence that made her skin crawl. Maddie stumbled back, the flashlight flickering. The shadow glided closer, moving faster than it should have been able to. Her breath caught in her throat. She ran to the kitchen, thinking she might barricade herself, but the lights went out entirely. In the darkness, she felt something brush her arm, cold, icy, like touching metal. She screamed and tried to get to the back door, but it wouldn't open. Desperate, Maddie remembered the basement storm exit. She dashed down the narrow stairs, the shadow following silently behind. The temperature dropped further. In the whispering now, a chorus of voices chanting her name. She reached the door, pushed it open, and tumbled into the cold night. Behind her, she could hear the faint scratching and laughter, growing faint as she ran across the yard to the neighbor's house. The neighbors called the police, who investigated the house. They found nothing unusual inside, except for strange markings scratched into the walls and the attic ladder left partially pulled down. No footprints, no sign of intruders, only the eerie sense that someone or something had been watching. Maddie's parents returned the next day, trying to reassure her it had been her imagination, the stress of being alone. But Maddie knew better. The house had a presence, something that thrived on fear and solitude. She moved out shortly afterward, and even now, years later, she sometimes hears whispers in quiet rooms or feels cold fingers brush her shoulder when she's alone. The old farmhouse remains empty most of the time, though occasionally someone rents it for a night. Locals whisper about the girl who was home alone, about the shadows that call your name, about the cold that makes your breath visible even indoors. And those who've stayed there alone sometimes tell the same story. Footsteps in empty rooms, whispers in the dark, doors that open on their own. Maddie knows the truth. Somewhere in that house, the shadow waits, patient, hungry, ready to find its next victim. Story the end. It was a stormy November night in rural Pennsylvania when 23-year-old Olivia Hart ended up alone in her family's old farmhouse. Her parents had gone out of town for a wedding, leaving her with strict instructions to lock every door and stay safe. Olivia didn't mind. She liked the solitude, and the house had always felt comforting during the day. But that night, the wind howled through the bare trees, and the shadows inside seemed deeper, twisting along the walls as if alive. Around 10:45 p.m., she was in the kitchen making tea when she heard it, a soft, dragging sound from upstairs. Her first thought was the old attic door creaking in the wind, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, and moving closer. Her heart quickened. She called out, "Hello?" but received no answer. The only reply was the echo of the wind rattling the windows. Olivia tried to calm herself, telling herself it was nothing, but the sound continued, climbing down the hallway above her. The floorboards groaned faintly in response, though she was alone. She grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs, each step trembling beneath her weight. As she reached the landing, she noticed the air had grown colder, her breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. At the end of the hallway, the guest bedroom door was slightly ajar, even though she was certain she had closed it earlier. Hesitant, she pushed it open. The room was dark, colder than the rest of the house, and smelled faintly of damp earth. As she stepped in, she saw scratches along the floorboards, forming words, "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the closet door creaked open slowly. Olivia froze, flashlight trembling in her hand. From the darkness, a small figure emerged, a young girl, pale, with hollow eyes and a faded dress. She tilted her head unnaturally and whispered, "Olivia, stay." Terrified, Olivia stumbled back and ran downstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. The whispers followed her, echoing through the walls, repeating her name in distorted, childlike voices. "Olivia, don't leave. Stay, stay." She tried the front door. Locked. The back door locked. The windows wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was alive, trapping her inside. From the basement came a dragging sound, heavier this time, like something large being pulled across the floor. She grabbed a kitchen knife and descended, heart pounding. The basement was dark, damp, and suffocating. A single beam of moonlight revealed the figure of the small girl, now joined by a tall, shadowy presence. They didn't approach immediately, but their presence pressed in from every direction. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, almost unintelligible but threatening. "You can't leave. You belong." Olivia backed away, but the basement door slammed shut behind her. She swung the knife blindly. It passed through the figures like smoke. They remained, watching, silent, except for the whispers that now seemed to come from inside her head. "Olivia, stay with us." Hours passed. She dared not sleep. Every sound, the wind rattling windows, the floorboards creaking, the distant tapping, kept her on edge. When dawn finally came, the basement was empty. Olivia fled immediately, driving to a friend's house and refusing to return. Weeks later, when she called her parents, she learned that previous owners of the house had reported similar experiences. Footsteps when no one was home, whispers calling their names, cold spots, and shadows moving independently. Olivia realized the house had never released anyone. It trapped those alone inside, leaving only the memory of fear behind. Even now, years later, when she passes old farmhouses or empty cabins, she feels the presence of the house lingering, whispering, waiting for the next person left alone. And sometimes late at night, she swears she can still hear a faint childlike voice whispering her name, "Olivia, don't leave. Stay." Story the end. It was a rainy Thursday evening in late October when 16-year-old Ethan Brooks was left home alone in his family's house in a quiet neighborhood of upstate New York. His parents had gone to a business conference in Boston, leaving him with the usual chores and a warning to lock all the doors and windows. Ethan didn't mind being alone. He usually enjoyed it, but that night the house felt heavier than usual, almost aware. By 7:30 p.m., Ethan was in the kitchen making himself a sandwich when he heard a soft thump upstairs. He froze. The house should have been empty except for him and his dog, Shadow. Shadow growled low, his ears perked. Ethan muttered, "Probably the wind," but the uneasy feeling in his chest didn't fade. Around 8 p.m., Ethan settled in the living room with his laptop. The storm outside rattled the windows, and occasional flashes of lightning threw shadows across the walls. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Ethan frowned, checking the bulbs. They were fine. The flickering stopped, but the shadows seemed wrong, stretching in unnatural ways along the walls and ceiling. By 9:15 p.m., Ethan heard it, faint footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, almost too measured to be an accident. Shadow growled again, moving to stand in front of Ethan. "Hello?" Ethan called, voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, moving across the hallway outside his bedroom door. Around 10:30 p.m., he tried calling his parents, but there was no signal. He picked up the landline only to hear static, then a whisper so faint he almost didn't hear it. "Ethan." His blood ran cold. He dropped the phone. The whisper repeated, clearer this time. "Ethan, come." Terrified, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the hallway. The air felt icy, unnatural, and the shadows stretched as if alive. At the far end of the hall, he saw it. A tall, thin figure, pale and indistinct, just standing there, watching him. When he blinked, it vanished. By midnight, Ethan could no longer stay in his bedroom. The whispers had grown louder, overlapping, a chorus of voices calling his name. Shadows moved along walls, corners, and the ceiling. He tried to escape, but the front door wouldn't budge. Shadow barked frantically, but nothing responded. Then came the basement. Ethan, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, descended the narrow stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. Deep scratches appeared along the walls, forming shapes he couldn't decipher. In the corner, shadowy figures pressed against the walls, their hollow eyes staring at him. A voice whispered, icy and clear, "Stay, forever." Panicking, Ethan bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind him. He ran to a neighbor's house, pounding on the door. Mrs. Hargrove, startled, followed him back cautiously. The house seemed calm again, lights stable, shadows gone, the air normal. But a faint sense of being watched remained. Over the following weeks, subtle signs persisted. Lights flickered. Objects shifted slightly, doors opened and closed on their own, and whispers called Ethan's name from empty rooms. The presence never fully revealed itself, never touched him, but its awareness was undeniable. Even years later, whenever Ethan returned to the house, he felt the weight of unseen eyes, the faint brush of cold air, and the occasional whisper of his name. The entity remained patient, always watching, never leaving, a silent inhabitant of a home he could never truly claim as his own. Story the end. It was a rainy November evening when 16-year-old Ava Thompson found herself alone in her family's old farmhouse in rural Kentucky. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving her to take care of the house and their dog, Buddy. At first, Ava enjoyed the quiet. She could watch movies, read, and snack without anyone telling her what to do. But as night fell, the house felt different. The shadows seemed heavier, the air colder, as if the walls themselves were watching. Around 7 p.m., Ava was in the kitchen making herself a sandwich when she heard a faint scraping sound coming from upstairs. She froze. The house should have been empty except for her and Buddy. Buddy growled low and hissed toward the ceiling. "It's just the house settling," Ava whispered to herself, though unease twisted in her stomach. By 8:30 p.m., she was in the living room trying to distract herself with a movie. Thunder rattled the windows, lightning casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized, but the shadows seemed wrong, stretching and moving slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. Around 9 p.m., she heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps upstairs. Ava's heart pounded. "Hello," she called, voice trembling. Silence. The footsteps paused, then resumed, approaching her bedroom door. Buddy growled fiercely, back pressed against her legs. By 10 p.m., Ava tried calling her parents, but there was no signal. Picking up the landline, she heard only static, then a faint whisper. "Ava!" Her blood ran cold. The whisper repeated, clearer this time. "Ava, come." Terrified, Ava grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped into the hallway. The air was icy and thick, and the shadows along the walls seemed to twist and bend. At the far end of the hallway, she saw it, a tall, thin shadow. featureless but undeniably human in shape. When she blinked, it vanished. By midnight, the whispering had grown into a chorus of overlapping voices, some crying, some laughing, all calling her name. The temperature dropped further. Objects shifted slightly on their own. Doors she knew she had locked were ajar. Buddy stayed pressed to her side, growling softly. A dragging sound came from the basement. Against her better judgment, Ava descended the narrow stairs. The air grew colder and heavier. Fresh scratches lined the walls, deep and jagged, forming shapes she couldn't understand. Shadowy figures pressed against the corners, hollow eyes staring at her. A voice, chilling and distinct, whispered, "Stay. Forever." Panicking, Ava bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She ran outside into the storm and pounded on her neighbor's door. Mr. and Mrs. Fields, startled, followed her back cautiously. The house appeared normal, lights stable, shadows gone, but the oppressive feeling lingered. In the following weeks, subtle disturbances persisted. Lights flickered, objects shifted slightly, doors opened and closed on their own, and whispers called Ava's name from empty rooms. She avoided the basement, attic, and any room she could. Buddy never left her side. Even years later, when she returned to visit, Ava felt the presence lurking in the corners, shadows moving at the edge of her vision, and whispers brushing past her ears. The entity never attacked physically, but its awareness was undeniable. Patient, watchful, ever present. It had claimed the house, and Ava knew she would never be truly alone there again. The end. It was a cold, rainy Wednesday night when Logan found himself alone in his parents' house. They had gone to a late-night dinner with friends, leaving him in charge of the empty home. Normally, Logan enjoyed the solitude, but tonight the house felt alive, as if it were watching him, breathing around him. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone when he first heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. At first, he thought it was just the old floorboards settling, but then came another sound, a slow, deliberate step, echoing across the hallway above him. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called, voice shaking. Silence answered, except for the rain pounding on the windows. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, yet the feeling of being watched remained, heavy and oppressive. Then came a whisper, barely audible. "Logan." His stomach churned. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the narrow staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, echoing unnaturally through the empty house. At the top of the stairs, he saw it, a dark, featureless figure at the end of the hallway. Its shape was humanoid, but its face was a void, absorbing the light from his flashlight. The figure tilted its head slightly, watching him. Logan froze. Then, without warning, it vanished. Panicked, he ran back downstairs, but the house seemed alive now. Floorboards groaned as if footsteps were following him. Doors slammed shut on their own, and soft, hollow laughter echoed from every corner. The whispers grew louder, circling him. "Logan, come! Join us!" He bolted to his bedroom and locked the door, pressing his back against it. Shadows stretched along the walls, forming humanoid shapes that moved subtly as if alive. The doorknob rattled violently, and the whispers became a chorus. "You cannot hide. We are here." Time lost all meaning. Logan huddled in the corner, clutching a lamp, trying to block out the sounds. The shadows pressed in from every corner, probing, twisting, waiting. When dawn finally arrived, the house fell silent. Shadows receded, the air warmed, and the whispers stopped. Logan stayed in his room until his parents returned later that morning. To them, the house was normal, peaceful, untouched. But Logan knew better. Whatever had haunted the house that night had not left him entirely. Even years later, whenever he was home alone, shadows seemed darker, corners sharper, and on stormy nights he could hear a faint whisper. Logan. He never stayed home alone again. Story the end. It was a dark, stormy Saturday night when Rachel found herself alone in her family's old two-story house. Her parents had gone to visit relatives, leaving her to manage the house for the evening. Normally, Rachel enjoyed the quiet solitude, but tonight, the air felt heavy, oppressive, and the shadows seemed unnaturally long. She was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, scrolling on her phone when she first heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. At first, she dismissed it as the old floorboards settling. But then came another sound, a deliberate step, slow and measured, echoing across the hallway above her. Rachel's pulse quickened. "Hello?" she called out, but only silence answered, except for the rain hammering against the windows. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, yet the feeling of being watched refused to fade. Then came a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Rachel." Her stomach churned. The voice seemed to come from all around her, and a chill ran down her spine. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs, the beam shaking as she swept it across the dark hallway. Everything seemed normal. Yet the shadows stretched longer than they should, twisting unnaturally along the walls. At the top of the stairs, she saw it, a tall, dark figure at the far end of the hallway. Featureless, almost like a living shadow, it tilted its head slightly as if studying her. Rachel froze. The figure didn't move, but the cold pressing from its presence made her shiver uncontrollably. Then in the blink of an eye, it vanished. Terrified, she ran back downstairs. The house seemed alive now. The floorboards creaked with invisible footsteps, doors opened and closed on their own, and soft, hollow laughter echoed from the shadows. The whispering grew louder, circling her. "Rachel, come, join us." She bolted to her bedroom and locked the door, pressing her back against it. Shadows stretched along the walls, some forming humanoid shapes that shifted and writhed. The doorknob rattled violently, and the chorus of whispers intensified. "You cannot hide. We are here." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning. Rachel huddled in the corner, clutching a lamp for protection, listening to the whispers, footsteps, and laughter. The shadows pressed in closer, probing, twisting, waiting. When dawn finally arrived, the house returned to silence. Shadows receded, the air warmed, and the whispers stopped. Rachel stayed in her room until her parents returned later that morning. To them, the house appeared perfectly normal and peaceful. But Rachel knew the truth. Whatever had haunted her that night had not left entirely. Even years later, shadows seemed darker, corners deeper, and on stormy nights she could hear a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Rachel?" She never stayed home alone again. Story the end. It was a late October night when Hannah found herself alone in her family's old farmhouse. Her parents had gone out to attend a wedding, leaving her in the house for the evening. Normally, Hannah enjoyed being alone, but tonight, the house felt different. The shadows seemed longer, the air heavier, and every creak sounded sharper, as if someone or something was moving around unseen. She was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket and scrolling on her phone, when she first heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but then came another sound, a soft, deliberate step moving across the hallway above her. Hannah's heart began to race. "Hello," she called out, voice shaking slightly. Silence answered, except for the rain tapping against the windows. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, yet the feeling of being watched remained, cold and oppressive. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft but chilling. "Hannah." Her stomach tightened. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, echoing unnaturally. At the top of the stairs, she saw it, a tall, dark figure at the end of the hallway. Featureless, almost like a living shadow, it tilted its head slightly, observing her. Hannah froze. The figure didn't move, but the cold pressing from its presence made her shiver uncontrollably. Then, in a blink, it vanished. Terrified, she ran back downstairs. The house seemed alive now. Floorboards creaked with unseen footsteps, doors slammed shut on their own, and soft, hollow laughter echoed from the corners. The whispering returned, louder and more insistent. "Hannah, come, join us." She bolted to her bedroom and locked the door, pressing her back against it. Shadows stretched along the walls, some forming humanoid shapes that shifted subtly like they were alive. The doorknob rattled violently, and the whispers became a chorus. "You cannot hide. We are here." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning. Hannah huddled in the corner, clutching a heavy lamp, listening to the whispers, footsteps, and laughter. The shadows pressed closer, probing, twisting, waiting. When dawn finally came, the house returned to silence. Shadows receded, the air warmed, and the whispers stopped. Hannah stayed in her room until her parents returned later that morning. To them, the house seemed perfectly normal and peaceful. But Hannah knew the truth. Whatever had haunted her that night had not left entirely. Even years later, whenever she was home alone, shadows seemed darker, corners sharper, and on stormy nights she could hear a faint whisper. "Hannah." She never stayed home alone again. Story. The end. It was a bitter December night in rural Vermont when 23-year-old Claire Adams was left alone in her family's old farmhouse. Her parents had gone to a funeral in Boston, leaving her with instructions to stay inside, lock the doors, and keep the fireplace going. Claire had always liked being alone in the house, but that night, the wind rattling the windows and the long shadows stretching along the walls made her uneasy. Around 11 p.m., she was sitting in the living room reading a book when she heard it, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. At first, she told herself it was just the house settling, but the sound was deliberate, moving along the hallway above. Her heart began to race. "Hello?" she called, but only the wind replied. The tapping continued, now closer, heavier, like someone pacing. Claire grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, her breath fogging in the beam. At the top, the hallway seemed longer than it should, darker than usual. The door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar, though she was certain she had locked it earlier. Small, childlike footprints led from the hallway into the room. Her pulse quickened. She pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the air was icy and thick. On the floor, scratches spelled out, "Don't leave me." Suddenly, the closet door creaked open. From the darkness emerged a small figure, a little girl, pale, with hollow black eyes and a tattered white dress. She tilted her head unnaturally and whispered, "Claire, stay with me." Terrified, Claire stumbled back and ran downstairs. The air pressed around her, suffocating. She tried the front door. It wouldn't budge. The back door? Locked. Even the windows refused to open. The house had become a trap. From the basement came slow, dragging footsteps. The whispers returned, overlapping, repeating her name. "Claire, Claire, stay, don't leave." Desperate, she grabbed a kitchen knife and descended into the basement. The room was dark, damp, and oppressive. In the far corner, the little girl stood, now joined by a tall, shadowy figure. They didn't move, only watched her, patient and relentless. The whispers turned into commands. "You cannot leave. You belong here. Stay forever." Claire swung the knife, but it passed through them like smoke. The temperature plummeted and shadows twisted along the walls into unnatural shapes. Hours passed. She dared not sleep. By dawn, the basement was empty, the house silent. Claire fled immediately, driving hours away. Even months later, she still feels the presence lingering, whispering in quiet rooms. Sometimes, just at the edge of her vision, she glimpses the small figure waiting, watching, insistent. "Claire, don't leave. Stay." Story. The end. It was a freezing February night in rural Pennsylvania when 22-year-old Ryan Foster found himself alone in his family's old farmhouse. His parents had gone to Philadelphia for the weekend, leaving him with instructions to stay inside and lock all the doors. The house had always felt safe to him during the day, but that night, as the wind howled through the bare trees and rattled the windows, the familiar creaks and groans of the floorboards sounded wrong. Around 10:30 p.m., Ryan was sitting in the living room scrolling through his phone when he heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping from upstairs. At first, he told it was just the house settling, but the sound was rhythmic, like someone pacing. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called. Silence. Only the faint creak of the stairs above. Grabbing a flashlight, he cautiously climbed the stairs. The air grew colder with every step, and his breath formed clouds in the dim light. At the top, the hallway stretched longer than he remembered, darker and foreboding. The door to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, though Ryan was certain he had locked it. Small, child-sized footprints led from the hallway into the room. His heart pounded. He pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the air was icy and thick. Scratches on the floorboards formed words, "Don't leave." Suddenly, the closet door creaked open. A small figure emerged, a little girl, pale with hollow black eyes and a tattered white dress. She tilted her head unnaturally and whispered, "Ryan, stay with me." Terrified, he stumbled back and ran downstairs. The air pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. The front door wouldn't budge. The back door? Locked. The windows sealed shut. The house had become a trap. From the basement came dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate. The whispers returned, overlapping, repeating his name. "Ryan, Ryan, stay, don't leave." Panicked, he grabbed a kitchen knife and descended into the basement. The darkness was suffocating. In the far corner, the little girl stood, now joined by a tall, shadowy figure. They didn't move, only watched him, patient and relentless. The whispers became commands. You cannot leave. You belong here. Stay forever. Ryan swung the knife, but it passed through them like smoke. The temperature dropped sharply, and shadows twisted along the walls into unnatural, grotesque shapes. Hours passed. He dared not sleep. By dawn, the basement was empty, the house silent. Ryan fled immediately, driving hours away. Even now, months later, he feels the presence lingering in quiet rooms. Sometimes, just at the edge of his vision, he glimpses the small figure waiting, watching, insistent. Ryan, don't leave. Stay. Story the end.